Oh, man, I just sat down in this chair and realized like I didn't plan an intro for this video. I guess I could tell a joke now. I don't like my jokes. I did the coffee bit in the last video. I don't know, guys. I mean, you know, stay tuned. We're gonna start. You are back for more U.S. history with Mr. Peterson, and that just warms my heart. I'm so glad that you're still hanging with us. Again, I know there's a small subset of you that are in my class, and you're required to watch these, but the rest of you, thank you. Yeah, that's pretty solid. Hey, if you remember, we've been talking about the original 13 colonies, and they haven't really been called the original 13 colonies yet, but that's obviously where we're going here. We talked about the New England colonies, all the way up in the north, talked about how many of them were founded for religious purposes. And then we moved our way in the last video, we'll link to it in the cards, talking about the middle colonies. And the middle colonies were settled for mainly proprietary reasons, lots of gifts given by the king to his buddies, and they set up colonies, and these colonies allow religious freedom, and they are economically prosperous. Now we're going to move into the final group of our original 13 colonies here in what would eventually become the United States of America. Cue the eagle. That was... So yeah, America, here we go. Southern colonies, let's get into them. First one we're going to talk about is a colony that we've actually already talked about. You remember what? Here real quick, tell the screen, what was the first permanent English settlement in the New World? Did you say Jamestown? High five. Good job. Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in the New World, and Jamestown was settled in what would eventually become the colony of Virginia. But before that, Jamestown was kind of teetering. You know about the starving time, you know about all the different things that happened there, but eventually there was a guy by the name of John Rolfe, and John Rolfe figured out that there was this crop that could grow in the New World. It was all the rage in Europe, and you could grow it at a surplus and sell it for a profit, and that crop was tobacco. And that's going to be kind of the theme of many of our different colonies here today when we're talking about the Southern colonies. We're talking about cash crops. Cash crops. You say, what is a cash crop? I'm going to tell you what a cash crop is. If you think about it, maybe in your world history class, you've probably studied a concept called subsistence farming. Subsistence farming. And what subsistence farming is growing enough food for you and maybe your immediate family to survive off of. You're growing your food to eat. And maybe, just maybe, if you have some extra after providing for yourself and your family, you can go and sell that and make a little bit of money with a kind of a side hustle. Cash crops are a little different. Cash crops are crops that you grow in large quantities with the express purpose of selling all of those crops for a profit, and that's how you make your money. Jamestown figured out that tobacco could be a huge cash crop opportunity in Virginia, and eventually many of the original Jamestown settlers had tobacco farms, and these tobacco farms have become very successful as they are harvesting the tobacco and sending it off to Europe. But one of the things that you need in order to have a large tobacco farm, first off, you need land, all right? And that land is going to bring you into conflict with a group of people that have been here for a little while, the Native Americans. You might remember them. We have Jamestown settlers branching out from Jamestown, seeking land so that they could establish their own tobacco plantations, trying to get rich, and they are coming into conflict with the Indians of that land. Not only are they having conflict with the Native Americans, we see also another negative of the cash crop economy that's popping up here in the Southern colonies, and that is the explosion of slavery in the United States. You remember back to 1619, where several indentured servants and also African slaves were brought to the English colonies in North America for the first time. We see exponential growth of slavery here in the New World, and a lot of it is because of the large plantations, all right, harvesting cash crops. And so lots of the original colonists here in Jamestown and in other southern colonies are going to rely heavily on slave labor. So you'll see how that starts to pop up a lot here in this section. Well, as Virginia settlers are expanding out from Jamestown and they're setting up their colonies, they're coming into conflict with Indians. That's creating problems for the King of England. So what he does, he actually revokes the charter, and Virginia becomes a royal colony. When that happens, all right, lots of things change, but one of the biggest changes, all right, is that Virginia also becomes like the center for Anglicanism, the center for the Anglican Church in the New World. Another key thing that happens here in Virginia's early history is that the city of Jamestown actually goes through a very devastating, a huge fire that that sweeps through the entire town. And during that time, they decided they're going to move the capital to another settlement by the name of Williamsburg. Williamsburg would serve as the capital until it moves eventually to the capital where it is today in Richmond, Virginia. So that's the settlement of our first southern colony. You kind of already knew about with your knowledge of Jamestown. So that's Virginia. It's expanding. It's now a royal colony. It's the hub of Anglicanism in the southern colonies and in the original 13 colonies. They still have their forms of representative government. The king allows them to keep the House of Burgesses. So you still have that birth of the American spirit taken on. That's what's happening in Virginia. Let's move on to our next southern colony. All right, we're going to be jumping around a little bit here as we study our southern colonies. We're not really doing it in a geographic way. All right, we're kind of doing it in more of a chronological, I don't know, kind of a chronological way. But basically what we're going to talk about now is the Carolinas. Wait a second, don't you mean North and South Carolina? Yes, I do, but originally they were settled as kind of like one big catch-all nebulous colony. And the reason why they were settled, well, we gotta go back to England, okay? If you know a little bit about world history and you study contemporary events to these things, which is a solid historical process that you guys should engage in anyway, you'll know that England is going through a little thing called the English Civil War. During the English Civil War, there was a group that remained loyal to the monarchy, loyal to the crown of England. King Charles I wanted to reward several of these noblemen for their loyalty. So what does he do? Well, like in the last video, he gives the easiest gift there is to give, land that he's never seen. And what he does is there's 8 noblemen that he actually gives a charter to settle the land south of Virginia, south of Jamestown. And the Carolinas are born this way. There are 2 types of people that settle the Carolinas. The first are tobacco farmers from Virginia. They start to move south and they end up in what would now be North Carolina. And they're setting up small tobacco farms. They're trying to not necessarily have a huge plantation. They're just trying to get a little bit to make a little bit of money for themselves, because the way that you establish wealth in the southern colonies was through mass producing agriculture. And we'll talk about a few more of those cash crops here in a little bit. So you have people moving south into North Carolina from Virginia looking to make these smaller type tobacco farms. Then you also have a group of people from the West Indies. If you don't know where the West Indies are, that's the Caribbean. If you don't know anything about the economy in the West Indies at this time, it is a huge plantation economy. So these guys are already familiar with cash crops. They're also already familiar with slave labor. And so they take their knowledge and their expertise, whatever you want to call it, and they bring it into what is now South Carolina. They set up a settlement called Charlestown, which would eventually become Charleston, South Carolina. You knew that already. You have these 2 groups that are moving in. You have small tobacco farmers in what is North Carolina. Then you have these large, massive plantation farmers from the West Indies moving into Charleston in the South Carolina region. And they're setting up their 2 different ways of life. Settlers in the southern part are bringing in lots of slaves. They're setting up these huge plantations. They're growing tobacco a little bit, but they're more interested in growing rice, which can grow well in the coastal plain. And then also they're interested in growing indigo, which also grows well in the coastal plain. So as we can see, tobacco, indigo, and then rice form a huge part of the Carolinian economy. But there's still a difference between Northern Carolina farmers and then your Southern Carolina farmers. So I believe it's 1742, 1748. A few years after the colony begins, they decide to divide it into North Carolina and South Carolina, and those differences that we discussed still hold true for some time. We see that England, the English government, wealthy English noblemen, people who already have money from their time in the New World already, they're using these areas and they're trying to make a profit off of the mercantile triangular trade system that we have studied already in this class. Now let's move on to our next colony. Our next colony is not founded for agricultural reasons, it's actually founded for religious reasons. Much like their counterparts in the New England colonies, Maryland was settled for another persecuted religious group in England. Real quick, tell the screen, what was the official religion in England? If you said the Anglican Church, you're right. If you said they were a Protestant nation, you're also right. So that means since they were a Protestant nation, since the official church was the Anglican Church, then you can bet that if you were a Catholic in England, you were going to have a bad time. And lots of the Catholics in England were being persecuted. They were being marginalized because they weren't members of the Anglican Church. And it was not a good thing to be a Catholic. Many of them would leave the nation altogether. However, there was a very prominent English nobleman that was a Catholic. And Charles I was somewhat sympathetic towards Catholics, and so he gives this nobleman a charter and makes him the proprietor, right, of land in the New World. Again, with the giving of the land in the New World. Anyways, they give him this land. He decides he wants to use this land to make a safe haven for English Catholics. His name was George Calvert, but he was known as Lord Baltimore, and maybe, Baltimore, Maryland, maybe you connected the dots. I don't. If you didn't, there's a city in Maryland called Baltimore, and it's named after him. So anyways, George Calvert says of this plan, he actually dies before this plan is enacted. So his son, Cecilius Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, because he got his dad's title and stuff when he died, he keeps his father's dream alive. He sets up a colony in the New World. They name it Maryland. I've heard two reasons for why it's called Maryland. Some say it's because they're Catholics and they worship the Virgin Mary, so that could work. Others say it's because King Charles's wife, right, who gave them the land, her name was Henrietta Marie, so they went with Maryland. Anyways, they call it Maryland, and it's a great place for English Catholics to go and to settle. The problem is there weren't that many of them, and so they didn't have a huge population coming into the New World. So what they decided would be a good move, and actually turned out to be a good move, is to invite other groups of people into Maryland. So they passed what's called the Act of Toleration, which makes religious freedom 100% legally backed in the colony of Maryland. So you had other colonies that were offering religious freedom, but Maryland legally enforced it. This was a huge step for religious freedom in what would eventually become the United States of America. So that is the founding of Maryland, founded for religious reasons by a Catholic English nobleman, a safe haven for Catholics everywhere. So we got one more colony to go. So the last colony that we're going to talk about today holds a special place in my life. It's a colony that, well, it's not a colony anymore. It's 2020. It's a state. It's a place that I call home. Not right now, I don't live there anymore, but that is the colony of Georgia. And to start with Georgia, we need to go back to England, obviously, like we do with many of these colonies, and we need to look at a specific person that wanted to see reform. We're filming this in 2020, so societal reform is at the forefront of everyone's minds, and it was in that spot as well here with a certain man by the name of James Oglethorpe. James Oglethorpe did not like the way that prisons and the penal system in England was operated, because basically it went a little something like this. Hey, can you pay for that? No, I'm kind of in debt. You're in debt? Straight to jail. Oh no, I'm being thrown in jail. That's right, jail. When can I get out of jail? You can get out of jail when you can pay off your debt. Okay, so I mean, is there like a job I can get while I'm in jail to help pay off the debt? No, you're gonna have to figure out how to pay off your debt on your own in jail. And scene. Okay, I'm sorry if that was cringy. I don't know. You got to keep the kids coming back to watch, right? Maybe if you make an idiot out of yourself, they'll show up to watch the... Anyways, that was a dramatic interpretation by Mr. Peterson about what it was like to be someone who owed money in England. That's right, you were thrown in jail. You got out of jail when you paid off your debt. But most people were in debt because they were poor, and if they could find somebody with money, they probably would have talked to them already. So there was really no good way for them to get out of jail. So James Oglethorpe said, this is dumb. Why would we throw people in jail and have to like pay to like feed them and house them and all, and they're in jail for life because they can't pay money to get out of jail? Why don't we give them an opportunity? What he does is he approaches the government of England. He says, give me a charter and I will set up a colony south of the Carolinas, and I will use it as a penal colony. We'll take our debtors from the English prison system, bring them across the Atlantic. They will be settlers. They can work off their debt. Once they work off their debt, they're free, and then they're also out of England. So people who were in jail are no longer in England. So the English government kind of liked the way this sounds. Like, hey, so you're saying we can get rid of our prisoners, not have to pay for them in our prisons, and then eventually they'll probably just stay in the New World anyway once they get free. Also, there was another added bonus to this colony existing. The most valuable English southern port was Charleston, South Carolina. Also, though, Charleston, South Carolina is only a few hundred miles from another famous port in the southern part of North America, St. Augustine. St. Augustine belonged to the Spanish. The English and the Spanish don't get along, so there was always this fear that Spain would eventually invade the southern part of the British colonies in North America. They decide, hey, it'd be great if there's an actual like buffer colony that we don't necessarily, like, we care about it, but we don't. It's kind of in between. We would at least have time to figure out what we would do if Spain starts to invade, and they can maybe fight them off for a little while. There's a whole thought process that goes into that. And so the king gives James Oglethorpe a charter. He goes and he settles. He names his new colony Georgia in honor of the king, King George I, and he settles south of Charleston in what would eventually become the modern-day city of Savannah. Now, James Oglethorpe's new colony of Georgia didn't really go as he had originally planned it. First off, there wasn't that many like guys in the prison system that wanted to come over. It was just as dangerous to go across the Atlantic Ocean as it was to be in an English prison at that time. So it's kind of a risk for them to even go. Secondly, James Oglethorpe outlawed two things in his colony that would deter settlers from settling there, unfortunately. The first thing he outlawed was rum. All right, he didn't like the alcoholic drink. He thought it made people people lazy, and he decided that there would be no in his colony of Georgia. The second thing he outlawed, and this was the bigger one, even though his reasons for outlawing it were great, he outlawed slavery in Georgia. What that did, though, was it discouraged plantation growth in Georgia. So really, he couldn't draw the interest of investors. He couldn't draw the interest of lots of people, because why settle in Georgia when I can settle in South Carolina or North Carolina or Virginia and get into that lucrative cash crop industry with essentially free labor? All right, so James Oglethorpe has these rules in place. It keeps Georgia from growing like the other southern colonies. Eventually, though, he moves on, and the charter for Georgia gets rewritten. Rum is allowed, slavery is allowed, and as a result, Georgia begins to get in on the plantation cash crop farming game. But James Oglethorpe, the founder of Georgia, really had a pretty revolutionary idea in the reasons why he wanted to found it. Also, too, Georgia really, it served its purpose as the buffer colony, because in like 1742, the Spanish in Florida tried to invade Georgia. Those are the southern colonies. Obviously, the success of the southern colonies was built upon the plantation system. Obviously, the plantation system had its flaws, the main flaw being the horror that was the slave system that you had in the southern colonies and eventually the southern United States. But now we have our 13 colonies, as they would be at the time of independence, are now all settled and intact. And in future videos, we're going to look at how life in those colonies and how politics and how wealth in those colonies start to form and take shape and eventually lead to what would be the War for Independence. Thanks for hanging out with us today. We'll see you next time. I bet you think you know what I'm going to say right now, but you don't. I'm just going to tell you have a nice day. See you later.